Hey, my name is Zeus Tipado, writer for Healing Maps, and I'm here to decode psychedelic brain networks. Brain networks are collections of different regions that show functional connectivity. But how do these areas of the mind adapt when using psychedelics? That's something worth understanding, so let's understand it. When it comes to psychedelics interacting with the brain, there are three interesting brain networks: the default mode network, DMN, the central executive network, CEN, and finally the Salience Network. All three networks communicate and modulate each other during a psychedelic trip. Let's start with the DMN, default mode network, and CEN, central executive network, also called the frontoparietal network, or FPN. In a greater sense, the DMN is a task negative network. This means when it's active, you're really not doing anything. Whereas the CEN and other working memory networks are task positive networks, which means when you're doing something like a task, it's pretty active. The DMN and the CEN have a negative correlation with one another. They're not enemies, they just have an inverse relationship. When the DMN is most active, the CEN quiets down, and when it's time for the CEN to be active, the DMN calms down. It's also called an antagonist relationship because neuroscience has a ridiculous habit of developing multiple names for the same thing. Since both networks operate so closely together, it's difficult to discuss the DMN without referencing the CEN, and obviously hard to talk about the CEN without bringing up the DMN. But we're going to do it anyway. This is what we're all here for. So first up, the ever-elusive default mode network. The DMN, undoubtedly the most boring name for such an incredibly fascinating network. So you've taken LSD on a Tuesday afternoon and you want to see what it does to your DMN. Well, the first thing that happens is the relationship the DMN has with the CEN becomes less antagonistic, and both networks build somewhat of a relationship with each other, like old high school rivals that found each other on social media. Through the work of University of Zurich, we now know the specific brain decoupling is responsible for the feeling of ego dissolution during a trip, or, as the scientists say, oceanic boundlessness. Another part of the DMN, the lateral parietal lobe, has two sections: the superior, which is upper parietal lobe, and the inferior, which is the bottom parietal lobe. Within the bottom parietal lobe is the angular gyrus and supramarginal gyrus. A gyrus is a way better name for what it actually is, which is a fold of brain meat. Frederick Barrett of Johns Hopkins University has theorized the separation of functional connectivity between the angular gyrus and supramarginal gyrus results in a cognitive experience of timelessness and spacelessness during hefty psychedelic trips. Now let's look at the Central Executive Network, or CEN, also called the Frontoparietal Network, or FPN. But for the sake of keeping the confusion to a minimum, we'll refer to this as the CEN. As mentioned earlier, the CEN is an active brain network. It's utilized when doing cognitive tasks like reading, looking for lost items. In other words, literally anything that requires the use of working memory and focused cognition belongs in the CEN. Like the DMN, the CEN has a habit of desegregating itself during a psychedelic trip, while simultaneously increasing its global functional connectivity with other parts of the brain, other parts like the DMN. And the Salience Network includes parts of the brain like the hypothalamus, central striatum, thalamus, amygdala, and other brainstem nuclei. Key research on this network is still ongoing. However, the leading theory is that the Salience Network is primarily responsible for switching between the DMN and the CEN. If the DMN represents off and the CEN represents on, the Salience Network is the light switch of both networks. The default mode network, Central Executive Network, and the Salience Network. Now, you have a working understanding of how brain networks modulate through psychedelics. I bet you never thought that would happen when you woke up today.